Thanks very much for joining us in this room in Cairns, and also for everyone online. So just for everyone, we've got a camera here, and I haven't sort of got the whole crowd circulating, but we can look at them through the camera up here. So it's kind of bringing a few people together. I'm going to monitor the chat. So people online, if you just want to add things to the chat throughout, I'm going to monitor the chat and I can pass that on. Or when it comes time to discussion, you'll be able to contribute to the discussion as well. But for a few of us who are not on this campus, JCU Cairns Smithfield campus is known as Nominbata campus, which means belonging to tomorrow, a place for tomorrow's learning, knowledge and wisdom, which kind of fits what we're doing here, right? It fits what we do here on a general basis. All of that reminds us that we are on Irriganji land. That name comes from the coastal dialect of the Jabbergai people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. This is our way to introduce you to the Roderick Centre as well. The Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing was established to foster the reading and writing of Australian literature in all its forms and to encourage the study of the broad field of Australian literature and literary cultures. That word, to foster an understanding of Australian literature in its broadest sense, is kind of why we're brought here today for this in conversation. It has the title from our visitor, Truth is a Stranger, Real World Inspiration for Speculative Fiction. And we have two fans of spec fic here, and maybe more fans of speculative fiction to bring into the discussion in this room or online, to listen to what is going to be a really interesting discussion between Dr. Rose Michael, our visiting fellow from RMIT. She's our current Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing visiting fellow, busy meeting and speaking with people while she's here, and then also finding her way down to Townsville a bit later in the year. Our other speaker interlocutor is Dr. Emma Wren, a research communicator and science illustrator. Emma's designed artwork for the Pint of Science Australia National Festival and was an awardee of the ABC Top 5 Science Media Residency in 2022. That's enough of an introduction. It's time for me to get out of the way of these two to be able to have this conversation. So it's a conversation between Emma and Rose for less than 1 hour, but then there will be time for us all to have discussion as well about what we're about to hear. So without further ado, welcome Rose, welcome Emma. I will step out of your way.
Thanks, Roger. I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on unceded country, and I think it's really relevant in the context of talking about knowledges other than our own, disciplines other than our own, that we are aware that this is unceded country, stolen land, and that we are guests here, and to just acknowledge and pay my respects to any elders past or present or any First Nations people in the room. So the session's about real-world research as inspiration for speculative fiction. So I'm a speculative fiction writer. I have 3 novels. One is not published on submission, and a host of short stories. And it's super exciting to be here, and thanks to JCU and Roger and everyone who's kind of invited me. And I feel like it's a real vote of confidence for speculative fiction and for this idea that we as fiction writers, but speculative fiction writers as well, that we do real research, as in traditional research, go out and interview scientists and read about stuff and explore the world, but we also do creative practice research, that we're actually using our creative practice to come to new knowledges and new kind of intuitive, empathic, imaginative understandings. And so when Roger kind of invited me to talk with Emma, I started looking at Emma's website. I just thought that the parallels and the differences perhaps were really interesting. And I sort of thought that in our conversation we could talk a little bit about the difference in our communication mediums, the difference in our art practices, as well as share concrete examples where we have found out cool stuff that has perhaps changed our thinking or changed, creativity or impacted kind of in our imagination. So I thought that I would ask Emma to introduce herself, but particularly the project that I was looking at on your website where you've invited scientists to talk to you kind of about their work, and then you sort of translate that into, you know, cartoons or kind of graphic communications. Do you want to share a little bit about that so that people have an idea of where you're coming from? Because a novel is something we're all sort of assuming that we have some understanding. It kind of looks like that, but I don't have any. But they do exist. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so I always struggle to introduce myself, and people go, "What do you do?" And I, lots of things. Yeah, so at the moment I'm calling myself a research communicator. I've just recently started working with Tropwater here at JCU, helping communicate their science. But until fairly recently, I was also a researcher, so background with archaeology and earth sciences. And it was through doing science that I realized I really liked talking about science and finding out about other people's cool science and going, okay, cool, how can we share that in a way that everyone can understand and can appreciate? And the fact that I'd already been sort of drawing comics and cartoons just for myself since high school, that somewhere along the way, like, I could be drawing stuff about my own research and about other people's research, and it kind of turned into a bit of a side gig, as well as, yeah, sort of doing more of the science communication kind of stuff for work. So the fact that I do that all the time now is a little bit surreal. This is kind of cool, and I'm, yeah, very happy to chat about it. So the project, it sounds like you probably talking about, is the Twitter science cartoons.
Yeah.
So it was, late 2021, I think. I can't remember exactly sort of what led to it, but I'm kind of like, I feel like I sort of need to do a bit more. I feel like doing more art stuff, but I sort of don't know what I should draw. So I decided I was going to do an art challenge, and there's a whole bunch of different ones online that you can do that have like lists of prompts where you can go, okay, you draw this thing this day and then something else the next day. But rather than doing that, also going out to find things, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to invite people to send me stuff for ideas. So in a way, it was, you know, trying to just crowdsource ideas. So because I was working in research at that point, I followed a fair number of researchers in different areas on Twitter, and Twitter was quite active at that point. It was still called Twitter. So I put a call out and basically went, are you a scientist? Tell me a little bit about what you do and maybe a little bit about what kind of stuff you like. And I'll draw a cartoon for you for free, of, you know, just something quick. And got a really big response. I only ended up doing it for a week because I think it ended up being 30 or 40.
Wow.
Yeah, people responded. And I ended up doing it almost like speed drawing, because the requests were kind of coming in so quickly, it meant that each day I'm like, okay, let's do a bunch of them. So at the end of the day, when I come home from work, and they go, okay, we've got, you know, 5 new ones, whatever, today, let's see if we can get a couple of those done tonight. And yeah, at the end of the week, I'm like, okay, I'll cut it off so I can finish the few I haven't done yet. And it was good because people shared it. So I said, yeah, feel free to share this, you know, so that more people get it. And it meant that I got a bigger response from different fields that I had nothing to do with. So it was someone who looks at spiders, and there were people who were looking at toxins in marine environments, people who have something to do with radioactivity, and I think it was also marine, as well as, you know, some who were more similar to my kind of field with earth sciences. So yeah, it was interesting that some of them were kind of like, this is what I do. Some of them were kind of like, this is the sort of area I do, and this is something that I like. So some of them were a bit more literal than others, and some of them were kind of a mishmash of here's a general topic that I study, and here's something about me, to make it sort of a bit more personal for them. And I could kind of make it whatever I wanted, because it wasn't for any other purpose other than this is an exercise for me to draw something, and then everybody who submitted something gets a cool picture out of it, hopefully.
So one of the things that really interested me about it is, so I had James Bradley as a mentor for this manuscript. And one of the things I've written about in a couple of sort of Sydney Review books, those kinds of publications, is around and kind of the climate catastrophe, and what do we do as artists in the sort of, if the world is burning, why am I writing a short story? And so one of the things I'm really interested in, Jane Rawson is also a good friend of mine, and talking to these kind of speculative fiction writers who are really engaged with the natural world and environmental sciences, and thinking, what does it mean to be a writer in this age of extinction? And James Bradley said something which I steal, where he was like, I'm not a very good activist, but I'm a good writer. Like, that's the thing that I can do. So one of the things that interests me about your project, which is quite different than where, you know, I have sort of written first and then done the research at particular areas, but I've sort of been driven with the research with the idea of how can my book work, how can it have impact in the world? I really believe in the novel as serving a particular purpose in a community, enabling us to see the multi-generational, impact of kind of cause and effect over time. Sort of thinking of, things like, shelf life or microplastics in the ocean, or these sort of hyper objects that are too big for us to see, but we can kind of see the impact of them. And I think, since the Grapes of Wrath kind of onwards, this is what actual novels can do, is they can kind of enable us to sort of chart, these sort of effects. So I wonder, with the scientists that approached you, what do you think is, why do you think they seized this opportunity? Like, what were the kinds of stories that they wanted you to synthesize or communicate for them?
Well, I feel like because it was such an open call, they probably didn't know what to expect. It was kind of like, I'll just draw you a silly cartoon, like see what happens. And all of them, it was a really lovely response. Like, everyone seemed to really love what kind of came out of it. I think it was because they went in with that expectation. They're going, oh, so if she's going to draw me something, like, do something with my science. And they might not have necessarily thought before how you might turn their work into something visual. So I think maybe that was part of it, then going, oh, I haven't seen my research in that way before. So for some of them it was funny things or whatever, because it was a bit personal to them. So there was one, so I'd say probably the silliest one that I did was someone who was working on, it was to do with a system that automated insulin, so an automated system for insulin for people who were diabetic. So she was sort of described, it was basically like a robotic pancreas was kind of the metaphor for it. And that she, particularly her hobby was roller skating. So I drew a metal robotic pancreas wearing roller skates. So with some of those, I think it was just kind of taking something of their science and something of them, and sort of so they could then see it. But also, I guess, kind of putting that joy into it as well, which is something that I try to do a lot with the cartoon kind of style that I go for it. Then going, this is fun, which obviously with the kind of particularly climate related kind of science that sometimes it doesn't feel fun a lot of the time. So it's nice to then go, this is cool. The work you're doing is cool, and then we can have fun with it.
So that reminds me of one of the things that I found through the course of writing this book, which is, the books tend to take sort of 5 years or so, is I was like, oh, the climate science, the research I'm doing is devastating. What can I do with that? And so one of the things that I sort of made this conscious choice, I wanted the book to be hopeful, and I was like, how can I use this scientific research in a hopeful way? So it's climate fiction. It's sort of predicated on the idea of the waters have sort of risen 50 metres down where I'm from in Melbourne and the Mornington Peninsula, and like just looking at maps of what would happen and speculating about what might happen to the marine life, with the conscious choice that I'm going to make it positive. And so then asking people, so to just give some of the examples of there's a lot of kind of animals, fauna in the book. And so, looking at things like there are more blue-ringed octopuses down on Mornington Peninsula than there have ever been before. None of the scientists I spoke to knew why. Lots of ideas about warming waters, sort of the animals sort of moving south, but, not a lot of knowledge. And me starting to think that I could turn this into a positive by imagining species on the brink of extinction returning. So the story might not be positive for humans, but it might be positive for others. And one of the things I came up against, like I was researching spider crabs, so there's these sort of shoals. I don't know what the collective noun of spider crabs is, a scary of spider crabs coming in. And when I spoke to the researchers, I wanted to use them as a metaphor, and actually I might ask you about this, not consciously as a metaphor. I'm not really into the idea that we would take facts and turn them into a metaphor, but there was a parallel with the girl in school that drew me to the idea of the spider crabs. And I wanted to know whether they stayed together or they went separately. Like, it just seemed important to know if I was going to use this. And I was talking to the scientists, and they were like, we don't know. We're at the point where we can work out why they come in, but we actually haven't, tagged, or we haven't done that research yet. And in fact, this was a guy who's on the board of Zoos Victoria, and one of the things he said to me, which is a line that's in the book, is he said, never be surprised by how little we know. Like we had no idea. And he also, that was some years ago, but that was the first time I sort of floated the idea of a panel where we would get scientists together and we would have creative writers getting story prompts from the scientists. And it was really funny because he was like, I'd love to be part of that. That's amazing. And then he was like, is that like a thing? Like, just this sort of skepticism around what even is speculative fiction, and is that like a job, and are you working in university? Which was, it's sort of quite funny. So back to that idea about like the metaphor, and the reason I guess I'm resistant to that is it seems to me to diminish the kind of the lived reality for these sort of non-human species, to sort of turn them into a metaphor. But I'm interested if we talk a little bit about the difference between your form, like the drawing form compared to the novel. Like, what do you think that the cartoon or the drawn form can achieve? So you sort of talk about humour, which made me think about hope. I think I'm a bit of a sad writer. I kind of, work against that limit. But what do you think is something about what the cartoon can do when it comes to the science knowledge or the science research that you're channeling?
Yeah, well, I think particularly the cartoon style, so you get that sort of humour element of it. Often I feel like I like to hope that it makes it feel a bit more accessible, like you look at it and that anyone can understand it and that you're not immediately put off. It doesn't look like a diagram. It's meant to be something that you enjoy rather than you look at this and you have to learn something and it's not going to be a fun time. But I guess also that you do have to do some sort of transformation to be able to get it into that visual form in the first place. And sometimes that does sort of force you to sit down and then go, okay, what is it that I really want to communicate here? And there are some things that are very difficult to get into visual form. And so sometimes you kind of have to figure out different creative ways around that. But yeah, it's also about sort of really distilling your message, because if you're drawing, and that's something that I have spoken to people about when I've talked about, like, if you're going to draw little cartoons about your own research, trying to figure out what maybe one key takeaway is if they don't get anything else from it, because you can't tell the entire story in one image, otherwise no one's going to take anything away from it. It'll end up being too complicated. So it sort of forces you to then go, okay, what's something sort of visible and tangible from the research, and trying to keep it really simple, which can be a real struggle, especially if it's your own research. I find it easier when I'm looking at other people's stuff rather than things that are closer to my own research background, because you get that distance from it and be able to pick out and then go, yeah, I think maybe it's that's what we should focus on.
What I really thought when I was looking at the stuff on your website was the synthesis, the synergies. You can, like, in the visual medium, you can kind of collapse things together.
Yeah.
Whereas in a way, the novel, it seems to me, might potentially be the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Like there's a New Yorker cartoon. I think it might have been when Jillian and I was talking to someone in those publishing sessions the other day. There's a New Yorker cartoon where a guy's sitting there with this huge manuscript and someone on the other side of a desk that says marketing says, and can you tell me what it's about in the sentence? And I often sort of think if I could say it in less than 80,000 words, I would. But it is taking me that long to work out what is it I'm trying to say about this, kind of the complex cause and effects, or the sort of ins and outs of that relationship. So I wanted to get a bit specific. And I was actually just thinking, you have another line on your website that I thought was great, where you said it's an icebreaker, not an abstract. Yeah. So maybe if we stick with the form for a moment and just tease out, how do these two forms, how are they different than academic writing or academic communication? What would you say we're offering in these mediums that is, I guess I'm thinking in that university parlance about translating research or research impact? I would argue we're doing more, and that's a kind of narrative we need to build in the academic space. How would you say that, that it sits against that kind of academic writing up of research?
Well, I feel like what you're saying as well before about sort of being the chunkier, I guess, kind of novel is a factor. I feel like with the longer form, you're being able to sort of go deeper and be able to follow the strands potentially as they're, sort of spreading out more so than you might in a paper, where you then go, no. What was your project? Stick to that. Don't explore what what that might branch into. Whereas what I was talking about before with the cartoons is kind of the opposite of then going, no, we're going to distill it down as much as possible. And it is that kind of icebreaker of then going, we can't get into a whole lot of detail here because this is just a single image, so it does mean we can't sort of go into all of the implications unless you're doing a full comic book, I guess, depending on what format you're working in. But yeah, I'd say that the visual sort of side of things, what that's offering is kind of that distilling it down to then go, you've got, in an academic paper, you potentially have, 8 pages to talk about exactly how you did it and exactly why that's important and how it fits in the context. I've given you one image that you have to figure out what are you going to say in this one image that's going to get people's attention, and it doesn't have to say everything, but yeah, trying to get people to sit down and then go, tell it to me in a sentence, can sometimes be a real struggle. So that's something I think that, the visual form kind of is something that, it brings across, because it forces you into that, and also forces you into being a bit more concrete about it than going, you can't sort of talk in vague terms. It's got to be something you can see. What does it look like?
And do you also think, I, as someone who's just primarily a creative writer,